In November of 1922, a British archaeologist broke through a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and became the first, a person in over 3,000 years, to lay eyes on the intact tomb of a young Egyptian pharaoh. Within months, the wealthy financier who had funded the excavation was dead, felled by a mysterious infection after being bitten by a mosquito. Newspapers around the world seized on the story, declaring that the pharaoh's curse had claimed its first victim. Over the following years, a string of further deaths connected to the tomb's discovery would only deepen the legend. This is the story of Tutankhamun's curse, one of the 20th century's most famous archaeological mysteries. Was there truly a supernatural force protecting the boy king's resting place? Or is the curse simply one of history's most successful media inventions, born from coincidence, sensationalism, and the public's genuine hunger for mystery? To understand how this legend took hold so powerfully, we first need to understand who Tutankhamun actually was, and why his tomb remained so remarkably undisturbed for millennia. While so many other pharaohs' burial sites had long since been looted or destroyed, Tutankhamun ruled Egypt for roughly 10 years during the 14th century BCE, ascending to the throne as a child of only about 9 years old, and dying under circumstances that remain genuinely debated by historians and archaeologists to this day. At the remarkably young age of approximately 18 or 19, because he died so young and reigned for such a brief period, Tutankhamun accomplished relatively little of lasting political or military significance compared to many of Egypt's other great pharaohs, and his memory was largely, and perhaps deliberately, erased from official Egyptian records by his successors, who had political reasons to distance themselves from the religious upheaval associated with his father, Akhenaten, a pharaoh whose radical attempt to shift Egyptian religious worship toward a single sun deity had proven deeply unpopular, and was reversed almost immediately following his death. This historical erasure meant that, by the time of the tomb's rediscovery, in 1922, Tutankhamun had become almost entirely forgotten, his name absent from the king lists that later Egyptian rulers had commissioned, making his eventual rediscovery all the more sensational, precisely because so little had been known or expected about him beforehand. The man responsible for finally locating Tutankhamun's tomb, Howard Carter, had spent decades working in Egypt as an archaeologist before his eventual triumph in 1922, and his path to that discovery was marked by considerable financial struggle, professional setbacks, and years of largely fruitless searching. Carter had begun his career in Egypt as a young illustrator and draftsman, gradually working his way into more serious archaeological roles through talent, persistence, and a genuine passion for Egyptology that outpaced his relatively modest formal education compared to many of his contemporaries in the field. Carter's excavation work was made possible primarily through the financial backing of George Herbert, the fifth Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy British aristocrat with a personal passion for Egyptology and archaeology, who had begun funding excavation work in Egypt partly for genuine scholarly interest and partly as a pursuit suited to a man of considerable leisure and independent wealth. The partnership between Carter's archaeological expertise and Carnarvon's financial resources proved to be one of the most consequential collaborations in the history of Egyptology, though it would take many years of largely unsuccessful searching before that partnership produced its historic breakthrough. By 1922, after several years of excavation work in the Valley of the Kings, without significant results, Carnarvon had reportedly grown increasingly frustrated with the substantial ongoing costs of funding Carter's search with no significant discoveries to show for the considerable investment, and was seriously considering withdrawing his financial support entirely. Carter, in what has become one of the most celebrated stories in archaeological history, persuaded Carnarvon to fund one final excavation season, arguing that a specific unexplored area of the valley, situated beneath the ancient workmen's huts from a later pharaoh's tomb construction, remained one of the few genuinely promising locations left unexamined. This final, nearly abandoned effort would prove to be one of the most significant gambles in the entire history of archaeology, leading within mere weeks to the discovery of a stone step that would ultimately reveal the entrance to Tutankhamun's remarkably intact tomb. On the 4th of November 1922, Carter's excavation team uncovered a stone step, cut into the bedrock of the Valley of the Kings, and over the following days, careful excavation revealed a full staircase leading down to a sealed doorway, its plaster still bearing ancient seal impressions that suggested the tomb behind it had never been fully entered or looted, an almost unheard-of discovery, given how thoroughly most other pharaonic tombs in the valley had been plundered, some in antiquity itself, by ancient tomb robbers operating not long after the original burials. Carter immediately sent word to Lord Carnarvon in England, and the Earl travelled to Egypt with considerable urgency, arriving in Luxor by the 23rd of November to be present for what both men understood might be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of their lifetimes. On the 26th of November, 922, Carnarvon and a small group of witnesses gathered before the inner sealed doorway, and Carter made a small hole in the upper left corner to peer inside, holding a candle to the gap and looking through into the chamber beyond. A moment later, immortalized by Carnarvon's famous question, asking whether Carter could see anything, and Carter's now legendary reply that yes, he could see wonderful things. What Carter had glimpsed was an antechamber, filled with an extraordinary array of golden furniture, statues, chariots, and countless other artifacts, an almost unimaginable wealth of preserved ancient material that immediately signaled this was a discovery of unprecedented archaeological significance. The subsequent careful excavation and cataloguing of the tomb's contents would take Carter and his team nearly a full decade to complete, given the sheer volume and delicate condition of the thousands of individual objects packed into the tomb's relatively modest chambers, objects that would go on to provide archaeologists and historians with an unparalleled window into ancient Egyptian royal life, religious beliefs, and material culture, given how few other pharaonic tombs had survived with anything approaching this level of completeness and preservati. Just months after the tomb's dramatic opening, Lord Carnarvon fell seriously ill after being bitten by a mosquito on his cheek, a seemingly minor injury that became infected after Carnarvon reportedly nicked the bite while shaving, allowing a more serious bacterial infection to take hold. His condition deteriorated rapidly, complicated significantly by his already fragile health, since Carnarvon had suffered severe injuries in an earlier automobile accident years before that had left him with chronically weakened lungs and general physical vulnerability. He developed pneumonia and blood poisoning, and died in Cairo on the 5th of April 1923, just under 5 months after the tomb's opening. The timing of Carnarvon's death, so soon after the historic discovery, proved absolutely irresistible to newspapers around the world, particularly given an additional detail that added considerable dramatic weight to the story. Reports circulated with varying degrees of accuracy that at the exact moment of Carnarvon's death, the lights across Cairo had mysteriously flickered and gone out, and that back in England, Carnarvon's beloved dog had reportedly howled and died at almost precisely the same moment. Details that, whether accurate, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated by eager journalists, became deeply embedded in the emerging popular narrative of a supernatural curse protecting the pharaoh's tomb from disturbance. The famous novelist Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and a committed believer in spiritualism and the paranormal, publicly suggested that Carnarvon's death might indeed have resulted from some form of ancient curse or supernatural protective force, lending considerable additional credibility and public attention to the curse narrative given Conan Doyle's own significant fame and cultural influence at the time. This combination of genuine tragic coincidence, sensationalized journalistic embellishment, and endorsement from prominent public figures created the foundational elements of a curse legend that would only grow more elaborate and compelling as additional deaths connected, however loosely, to the tomb's discovery and excavation occurred over the following years. In the years following Carnarvon's death, newspapers and curse enthusiasts eagerly compiled growing lists of additional deaths connected, often quite tenuously, to Tutankhamun's tomb, its excavation team, or anyone who had visited the site in the years following its opening. These included figures such as George J. Gould, an American businessman who reportedly visited the tomb and died shortly afterward from a fever, and Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who had X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy and died. Not long after completing the procedure, deaths that, examined individually, involved plausible and unremarkable medical explanations, but which, compiled together into a single dramatic narrative list, created a genuinely compelling impression of some mysterious, coordinated force at work. However, when examined with proper statistical and historical rigor, the curse narrative collapses considerably. A study conducted decades later by researchers, examining the actual lifespans of the 25 people known to have been present at the tomb's official opening in 1923, found that these individuals lived to an average age of roughly 70 years, entirely consistent with, and in some cases exceeding, normal life expectancy for people of their era and social class. Hardly the pattern one would expect if a genuine, supernatural curse was systematically claiming victims among those most directly connected to the tomb's disturbance. Howard Carter himself, the man most directly and personally responsible for the tomb's excavation and disturbance, and who would seemingly represent the most obvious potential target for any genuine curse, lived for a further 17 years after the tomb's opening, dying in 1939 at the age of 64 from lymphoma, a death entirely unremarkable in its timing or medical circumstances, and notably occurring considerably later than several of the more dramatically publicized curse-related deaths that had already helped cement the legend in popular consciousness years before Carter's own eventual, quite ordinary passing. Crucial element that lent early credibility to the curse narrative involved widespread but ultimately inaccurate reporting that an inscribed curse had actually been discovered within the tomb itself, explicitly threatening death upon anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's eternal rest. This detail, repeated extensively in contemporary newspaper coverage and popular retellings of the story for decades afterward, has no basis in the actual archaeological record of Tutankhamun's tomb specifically. No such explicit curse inscription was ever found within the tomb's chambers or on any of its recovered artifacts. This particular myth appears to have emerged from a combination of general public awareness that curse-like inscriptions did genuinely exist in certain other ancient Egyptian tombs and religious contexts, combined with considerable journalistic embellishment eager to provide readers with a more concrete and dramatic textual basis for the supernatural narrative already taking shape following Carnarvon's death. Some journalists reportedly fabricated specific curse wording entirely, while others may have genuinely, if mistakenly, conflated general knowledge of curse formulas found in other ancient Egyptian contexts with the specific and, in this regard, curse text-free reality of Tutankhamun's own tomb. It is worth noting that ancient Egyptian tombs did, in some genuine instances, contain warnings or curse-like inscriptions intended to deter tomb robbers and protect the deceased's eternal rest, reflecting authentic ancient Egyptian religious beliefs about the sanctity of burial sites and the potential consequences of their desecration. However, these genuine inscriptions were relatively rare even among ancient Egyptian tombs generally, and Tutankhamun's tomb specifically contained no such warning, a historical detail that the enduring popular curse legend has largely ignored, or simply never accurately incorporated, continuing to circulate in popular culture even today, despite being straightforwardly and definitively contradicted by the actual archaeological and textual record established by Carter's own meticulous documentation of the tomb's contents at the time of its excavation. Beyond simple statistical debunking of the curse narrative, modern science has proposed several genuinely plausible explanations for why some individuals connected to ancient Egyptian tomb excavations, including Tutankhamun's, might have experienced legitimate health complications following their exposure to long-sealed burial chambers. Explanations rooted in real microbiology and environmental science rather than the supernatural. Sealed tombs, closed off from fresh air circulation for thousands of years, can potentially harbor dangerous molds, bacteria, and fungal spores that develop within organic materials left in the burial chamber, including food offerings, textiles, and even human remains themselves. Certain molds, including some strains of Aspergillus, have been documented in various ancient Egyptian tomb environments and are known to pose particular respiratory health risks to individuals with compromised or weakened immune systems, precisely the kind of vulnerability that afflicted Lord Carnarvon given his already fragile respiratory health following his earlier accident, a genuine scientific explanation entirely consistent with his subsequent illness and death without requiring any invocation of supernatural forces to account for the tragic timing of his passing so soon after the tomb's opening. Additionally, some researchers have proposed that certain sealed tomb environments might accumulate elevated levels of ammonia gas or other potentially harmful compounds resulting from the gradual decomposition of organic materials over centuries of complete enclosure, creating genuine respiratory and health hazards for anyone entering such spaces for the first time in millennia. Without appropriate precautions, hazards that ancient Egyptian embalming and burial practices focused primarily on preservation and religious ritual rather than any anticipated future disturbance of the tomb would obviously have made no provision to mitigate or warn against for later visitors. These entirely natural, scientifically grounded explanations provide a far more credible account of any genuine health risks associated with tomb excavation than any supernatural curse narrative, while still acknowledging that entering long-sealed ancient spaces did carry real, if entirely explicable, potential health hazards worth taking seriously from a modern scientific and archaeological safety perspective. The extraordinary and lasting power of the Tutankhamun curse legend cannot be fully understood without examining the broader media and cultural context of the early 1920s, a period marked by intense public fascination with archaeology, ancient Egypt, and the mysterious and exotic more broadly, a cultural phenomenon sometimes referred to as Egyptomania that had been building steadily throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries as European and American excavations progressively revealed more of ancient Egypt's remarkable material culture and history to Western audiences. Newspapers of the era, engaged in intense circulation competition and increasingly reliant on dramatic, attention-grabbing headlines to sell copies in a crowded media marketplace, found in the Tutankhamun discovery, and particularly in Carnarvon's subsequent death, an almost perfectly constructed sensational story combining genuine scientific significance with exactly the kind of mysterious, supernatural undertones that reliably captured public imagination and drove sales. The London Times had, notably, secured exclusive rights to report directly from the excavation site itself, an arrangement that created considerable resentment among competing newspapers who found themselves largely excluded from direct access to the story's central figures and had correspondingly greater incentive to generate their own compelling angles and narratives, including the curse story, to compete for public attention and readership. This media dynamic, combined with the genuine cultural resonance of ancient curse narratives within existing Western literary and folkloric traditions, familiar already through Gothic fiction and earlier mummy-related popular culture, created ideal conditions for the curse legend to take root and spread with remarkable speed and staying power. The story tapped into deeper cultural anxieties and fascinations regarding archaeology's inherent act of disturbing the dead and violating spaces explicitly designed and consecrated for eternal, undisturbed rest, a genuinely resonant cultural and psychological theme that helps explain why the curse legend has persisted so robustly in popular culture for a full century. Now, despite being thoroughly and repeatedly debunked by rigorous historical and statistical analysis, beyond the curse legend that has come to dominate much of the tomb's popular cultural memory, the genuine and lasting historical significance of Tutankhamun's tomb discovery lies in the extraordinary wealth of authentic archaeological and historical information it provided regarding ancient Egyptian civilization, religious practice, and royal material culture, information that has proven immeasurably valuable to Egyptology as a scholarly discipline in the centuries since Carter's initial discovery. The tomb's more than 5,000 individual catalogued artifacts, ranging from the famous Golden Death Mask to elaborate furniture, weapons, clothing, and religious objects, provided historians and archaeologists with an unprecedented and remarkably complete window into the material realities of ancient Egyptian royal life. Modern scientific analysis of Tutankhamun's own mummified remains, conducted using increasingly sophisticated techniques over the decades since the tomb's initial discovery, including detailed CT scanning and genetic analysis conducted in the early 21st century, has provided historians with considerably more accurate and nuanced understanding of the young pharaoh's actual cause of death, an area that generated its own considerable historical speculation and debate over the decades, including earlier theories suggesting he may have been murdered. This more recent scientific analysis has instead suggested a considerably more mundane, if still tragic, explanation, indicating that Tutankhamun likely suffered from a combination of genetic health complications, probably related to extensive inbreeding common within the Egyptian royal family of this era, combined with a serious leg fracture that appears to have become infected, potentially compounded by a bout of malaria evidenced in genetic testing of his remains, ultimately contributing to his early death rather than the more dramatic assassination theories that had earlier captured public imagination. Tutankhamun's tomb and its contents continue to tour internationally in carefully managed museum exhibitions, drawing enormous public crowds and sustained fascination that speaks to the discovery's continuing cultural resonance a full century after Carter's historic breakthrough, a testament to how thoroughly this single archaeological find, largely accidental in its final circumstances given how close Carnarvon had come to withdrawing funding entirely before the crucial final season of excavation, transformed both the scholarly discipline of Egyptology and broader popular understanding of and fascination with ancient Egyptian civilization. So was there truly a supernatural curse protecting Tutankhamun's tomb from disturbance, one that claimed the lives of those who dared to breach its ancient seals. The historical, statistical, and scientific evidence, examined rigorously and without the sensationalism that characterized much of the original 1920s media coverage, provides an unambiguous answer. No genuine curse text was ever found within the tomb. The actual lifespans of those most directly connected to the excavation showed no statistically unusual pattern of early death, and the specific deaths most prominently associated with the curse narrative, particularly Lord Carnarvon's, have entirely plausible and well-documented natural medical explanations rooted in his pre-existing health vulnerabilities rather than any supernatural intervention. Yet the curse legend's remarkable persistence and continued cultural resonance, even a full century after the tomb's discovery, reveals something genuinely important about the intersection of archaeology, media sensationalism, and deep-seated human fascination with mystery and the supernatural. The story emerged from a perfect combination of circumstances: a genuinely spectacular archaeological discovery, a wealthy patron's tragic but medically explicable death, occurring at dramatically resonant timing, an intensely competitive media environment eager for sensational content, and a cultural moment deeply receptive to Egyptian mysticism, and Gothic supernatural narratives, already well established in popular literature and early cinema of the era. What makes Tutankhamun's curse endure as one of history's most famous and enduring myths, more than perhaps any of the specific factual details of the case, is precisely this demonstration of how compelling narratives can take root and persist in popular culture regardless of, and sometimes seemingly in direct proportion to, the strength of evidence actually supporting them. The genuine historical and archaeological legacy of Carter's discovery, an unparalleled window into ancient Egyptian civilization that has enriched scholarly understanding for a full century, remains for many casual observers considerably less well-known and less culturally resonant than the entirely fictional curse narrative that grew up alongside it, a telling illustration of just how powerfully mystery and the supernatural can compete with, and often overshadow, genuine historical achievement in capturing lasting public imagination.